Hi everybody, it's David Thompson. Welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm joined today by Kathryn Shively Meier, who is an assistant professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University and the recent author of Nature's Civil War, Common Soldiers and the Environment in 1862 Virginia, which is now out with the University of North Carolina Press. So Dr. Meier, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, we're getting into I want to say kind of a bit of the underbelly of the war, and we're looking at it really on the ground. And I think that's what sets this book apart, particularly from some of the other recent works that have been featured on our program here dealing with medicine and the war, which are much more top-down. You give us a chance to look at what it's like on the ground in Virginia in the year 1862. So why don't you start us off a little bit by telling us, broad overview of what this book is really about.
Well, I came to want to write a medical history from the soldier's perspective because when you look at soldiers' letters and diaries, most of what they write is actually, I guess I would say, fairly quotidian and boring. Their letters and diaries are they read as a list of rations drawn and what the weather was like that day. And in the past, this had been very much ignored by scholars because, again, it seemed so boring. But I kind of looked at this and said, well, what if we took it seriously and actually tried to analyze something about their culture and why they were talking about environment so much? So that's how I came to this book, which I'd say, as a broad overview, is essentially an ethnographic history of common soldiers' perspectives on the environment. And what they believed was that environment was one of the primary causes of their illnesses and fluctuations in their mental health. So they came up with ways to basically combat their natural enemy.
Now, when you're dealing with a topic like this, I imagine scope was one of the first things that you had to decide and kind of a case study, if you will, because to tackle this for the entire war, I think you probably would never really be truly able to finish it because you'd always be looking for more sources, or could be. So how did you decide on 1862 Virginia as really your focal point?
Yeah, this is a good question because it's pretty much true that any soldier letter or diary you open up is going to say something about the environment that has relevance to my book. The reason I picked 1862 Virginia, there's two reasons. There's one that has to do with the environment and one that has to do with the year. So just on the topic of environment, the Shenandoah Valley contemporarily was considered by Americans to be this kind of health Eden where people would go basically to spas and soak in the waters and recover from illnesses. So it was considered very healthy, whereas the peninsula was a swampy area, and based on the contemporary miasma theory, that was considered to be a very unhealthful, insalubrious place where people would contract diarrhea and dysentery and malaria and typhoid and all of these nasty things, and actually mental ailments as well. People believed that southern and western environments could lead to hysteria and other types of mental problems. So I decided that I could look at Virginia and get two really varied environments that people contemporarily considered extremely different. And that way I could tell if soldiers had a different health experience in the valley versus the peninsula. So that's why I picked those environments. Now, the year 1862 was also perfect because, as it turns out, there's a campaign going on somewhat simultaneously in these two areas in 1862. And the other thing is that soldiers, when they first gathered in camp, immediately succumbed to contagious diseases. And they knew that they were crowd diseases. That's what they called them at the time. Things like diphtheria, whooping cough, smallpox, scarlet fever. And I wanted that wave of contagious diseases to sort of pass, because then you really see the soldiers focus on environmental diseases or things they thought were environmentally caused. So 1862, perfect moment for two simultaneous campaigns, perfect moment for soldiers to be talking about environmental problems.
And obviously, yes, the book is primarily focused in 1862, but you lead in a bit with kind of the antebellum medical situation and kind of what's the frame of mind, I guess, for these soldiers on both sides as they start to enter into these armies and they're creating, and I think it's a wonderful point that you make. I think you say that the Army of the Potomac is the second largest city in the Confederacy after New Orleans by 1862.
Right.
What is their mindset as they head off to war in terms of how they're viewing the medical situation and how they view disease, both from a physical and mental standpoint? And I think the mental point you're going to get to later in greater depth, because that certainly changes.
Yeah, this is a complicated question, so I'll try to boil it down as much as possible. I guess the first thing, I'll say three things, and the first thing I'll say is that when it came to the professional medical scene, right before the Civil War, things had fallen apart. Heroic medicine was still the sort of traditional medicine, and that's the four humors and the fact that, you have to keep the four bodily fluids in balance by basically expelling one of the bodily fluids by bleeding or vomiting or other, delightful sorts of treatments that lead to exhalation. So as far as the professional medical scene, that kind of traditional medicine was actually coming under attack globally and indeed in America. And in the 1830s, homeopaths had basically caused most of the states to repeal licensing laws. So professional doctors felt very much under attack. And what this meant for lay people, which are our future common soldiers, was that more than ever people had fallen back on folk medicine, and they had more resources to do so than they'd ever had before. This was the heyday of the domestic manual, when everyone had a household copy of natural remedies, do-it-yourself bloodletting, and they felt like they were empowered to treat anything from cancer to mental ailments like hysteria, all at home. And for most lay people, you rarely saw a doctor. You were usually treated by your mom or your sister, loved ones in the house, this kind of very privatized, individualistic Jacksonian America healthcare, and which was very comforting to them, especially because, contemporary medicine didn't really understand disease that well and was not all that effective either. And then the final thing I'd say about the antebellum atmosphere is that most Americans, whether they were professional or a lay person, subscribed to some kind of idea of disease environment that I had mentioned earlier, this idea that especially Southern and Western environments were virulent, potentially harmful, and that if you were going to live in a place like that, it took time to become seasoned or bodily accustomed to that particular area.
So by the time we actually do get into the war and these soldiers are now in their environs and the crowd diseases, if you will, have started to pass,
right.
How does kind of nature and its environs really impact the soldier experience on a physical as well as a mental health level?
So, the soldiers basically acted exactly the way you'd expect them, given what I just told you about the antebellum thinking. They were introduced into these highly foreign environments to them. Unless you were a Virginian, Virginia felt like a foreign country. Most of these men had never been very far from home. And they perceived the environment as hostile, and it was more hostile. So I'll start with their perception. They believed that bad weather, exposure to the elements, swift changes in seasons, swamps, roily water, all sorts of these environmental aspects had negative impacts on their physical health, leading to things like fevers, rheumatism, diarrhea, dysentery. And then on the mental side, they also basically credited these environmental phenomena with making them lonely, homesick, depressed. They would say, I have the blues. And insects were a part of that too. Insects were highly irritating to them as well. So that's kind of their perception of what was going on. And in fact, I think it's important to also realize that war environments are or were more dangerous to their bodies and to their mental health, again, because they're traveling in city-sized armies without infrastructure. So you've got 100,000 people in close proximity with, latrines being dug, but men not necessarily using them, especially this early in the war. Then you have exposure. Men were constantly throwing off their coats and leaving their tents behind, and then the next day it would be freezing, but they had thrown it off because it was too heavy to carry. So exposure, then the insects were very attracted to these large populations of humans and dead bodies, based on, combat or horses dying, etc. So they were surrounded by flies, surrounded by mosquitoes. So this environment was far more threatening than it would have been under peacetime circumstances.
So these medical crises do emerge, and
Yeah.
to their credit, the Union and Confederacy don't turn a completely blind eye. They don't say, have at it, guys, and figure it out yourselves. They see the situation arising, and they do something. What do the Union and Confederacy, these officials in both their respective governments do to try to combat these issues that are arising in camps?
Yeah, well, again, 1862 is a great year to look at that, because there's some time under their belts. And as I mentioned, the first thing that happened when soldiers gathered in camp was they became massively ill. About 50% of an army population would succumb to contagious diseases. And on the U.S. side, they had the advantage of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which immediately began collecting statistics and released this condemning report, I guess I'll put it, in December of 1861, where they said, look, everyone's sick because the surgeons are bad at their jobs. They hadn't properly, scrutinized the troops before allowing them into the ranks. 53% of the United States troops they looked at, they felt shouldn't have been allowed into the ranks at all because they weren't fit to soldier. So this was a wake-up call for the Union in particular, but both sides certainly had, medical crises on their hands. Both sides began to introduce legislation in Congress to try to make improvements to their medical structures. Both sides also did things on the ground, like moving where their hospitals were located to high ground away from swamps. Things like just introducing more hospitals, better evacuation systems, improving rations, because at this point in 1862, both sides had massive scurvy outbreaks because they hadn't been issuing fruits and vegetables. And the men hated the desiccated vegetables, which were sometimes issued, and I think were larger parts tree bark often than actual vegetable. So these sorts of things are what the medical department started to improve in 1862. That being said, you really didn't start to feel the effects of the improvements until the fall and winter of 1862. So the year I look at is still a great chance to catch the soldiers in action, taking care of themselves and really needing to, because the structures are only just starting to emerge. And then all of that being said, the soldiers didn't necessarily want to be treated by the official structures. So no matter how good they got, soldiers resented them. And that's, again, because of their antebellum experience. They wanted to be treated in a personal, individualized manner. Hospitals were completely foreign to them. Most people had never been to a hospital unless they were destitute in the antebellum period. So they were terrified of hospitals. They thought they'd go there and die. They were afraid of the medicines that the surgeons were administering because, they didn't really understand how the medicines worked, but they did understand that if they had dysentery and you gave them a laxative, they weren't going to feel any better. In fact, they were going to feel worse. So they often complained they'd receive medicine and then be near death. So they didn't like the way the surgeons treated them. They didn't like the hospitals. The other thing is the official structure mandated that if you were sick, you reported to sick roll in the morning, and there a surgeon would examine you and decide if you were sick or not. And many times the men were actually accused of malingering or faking illness. So that really made them angry. And then if they were determined to be ill, that's when they got the medicines they didn't like. So they resisted even the improvements in the medical structures, is what I'd say.
And you've mentioned this, and certainly it's really the heart of your book. You're talking about the soldiers taking care of themselves and this issue of self-care that really comes out of this. What was self-care, and kind of how did soldiers work their own personal care into the Army, into their daily lives, realizing, hey, I've got to do something myself if I want to live.
Right.
It's not just quality of, it's not just I don't want to feel bad on a day-to-day basis, but I do want to live as well. What did they do themselves to be proactive in all of this?
Yeah, so I should mention self-care is my term for it. So it's my shorthand for it. It was not necessarily the contemporary term, but what it is basically any soldier adaptation to the environment of war in order to facilitate survival. Many of their techniques were geared toward preventing disease or preventing fluctuations in morale. Some of them were geared toward treating. So I'll just give a few examples because, it's highly individualistic and there are as many techniques as you can imagine. But some of the most common were bathing more frequently than ordered, which sounds kind of silly, but in some cases, especially for Stonewall Jackson's troops in the Valley, they were doing so much marching, over 600 miles in like 46 days, that they hardly were ever ordered to stop and bathe. So they'd have to sort of just, you would read stories about men just kind of slipping to the wayside, jumping in a pond, and coming back real quick to the ranks. So that was good, keeping clean. Other things, of course, were they would go to a watering source and just smell it and look at it and think, oh, that's putrid. I don't want to drink that. And they were, of course, right to be worried about that kind of water. So they boil it and make it into coffee or tea because it tasted more palatable. But of course, we now know that that also killed bacteria. Other things they do that were really creative, they'd drain their camps of moisture so that mosquitoes wouldn't be as attracted to them. They'd use smoke as deterrents to keep away mosquitoes. They would construct really elaborate tent and bed structures together. They'd sort of make a game of it. And this would help protect them from the elements because they were concerned about the weather making them ill. So those are some of the more environmental sorts of things they did, but they also used non-environmental techniques for combating environmental effects on their minds and bodies. One of the most common things they do was simply to write letters home to improve their spirits. You can see soldiers who start off very depressed in the beginnings of their letters. By the end of a letter, being downright jolly because they're connecting with loved ones. And a lot of what is making their morale fluctuate is homesickness because they've never been away from home before. Another thing they do was to straggle or temporarily leave the ranks to receive private treatment. If they were ill, they'd knock on a civilian's door and say, hey, can I spend the night in your house? A hot meal, shelter over my head. And even if they were Union soldiers, sometimes the Confederate civilian would say, yes, I'll charge you $1, but come on down, right? So straggling was a large part of self-care as well. Finding a better shelter to put over your head, finding better food, straggling to find fruits and vegetables to improve your diet so you didn't have to eat the desiccated vegetables. So those are the basic techniques. And then what you also alluded to is that in order to achieve this, soldiers recreated based on the antebellum model, these kind of networks of care in order to support themselves. And of course, first in the line of your network of care were other soldiers, comrades. And most soldiers you actually knew from home because of the way units were locally raised. So soldiers nourished each other in each other's tents. They'd share rations. They'd share techniques and advice. And then the kind of next group of people you turn to would be either people at home through correspondence, which soldiers constantly were asking for a pair of rain boots, more potatoes. They were always asking for food to be sent to the front, and it was always rotting, and then they'd be really disappointed when it got there. And then, of course, they turned to civilians around the area. I already mentioned private homes, but they'd also turn oftentimes to women and African Americans because they were the launderers or the cooks or other people who were hanging around for advice, for care, etc.
Now, not everyone embraced self-care within the armies, and there is some pushback to this
Right.
within the ranks in terms of higher up the ranks, certainly. And you allude to this in a great chapter. I wonder if you could speak to this a little bit about kind of this pushback, this resistance to these soldiers really taking this matter into their own hands and not necessarily following orders in the process.
Right. I mean, of course, the Army is predicated on not being an individual, on breaking down individuality and learning how to be essentially a unit, a self-sacrificing unit. And self-care is this kind of Jacksonian individualism at its worst from the command perspective. And we always have to bear in mind that in the Civil War, we're mainly talking about volunteers, so they're citizen soldiers who are not professional soldiers, who there's an enormous learning curve for. So discipline of volunteer units was quite loose in the early part of the war. And command really had a showdown with their common soldiers over the issue of straggling. Straggling is the point where this really comes to a head. So again, temporarily leaving the ranks without orders to achieve this kind of healthcare. And command is not going to look at it like, look, these guys are actually getting healthier and happier, which they were. I found in my study that self-care did improve spirits, it did improve health. But for command, that's not the part they're focusing on. The part they're focusing on is, I need to wage campaigns, I need to wage battles, and you're not here. Right? So this was a tremendous problem for McClellan, for Lee. Lee became so enraged by stragglers by the fall of 1862 that he was calling them the cowards of the army. He was having his officers march in the rear to collect these guys. And Stonewall Jackson, he had really had a terrible straggling problem, especially amongst his troopers, his cavalry. When they were in the valley, they were stationed near home. So they would just take off for 2, 3, 4 weeks at a time on the French furlough. And the discipline was terrible in his units. So Stonewall Jackson became so irate at this that by the fall of 1862, he had a number of well-publicized executions in his ranks for desertion after their courts-martial. And when you look at the actual courts-martial, some of those men may have only been straggling. But he wanted to make an example and try to curb this disciplinary problem. So by the end of 1862, I'd say discipline was improving and straggling had been cracked down upon, particularly threatening men by removing their pay was a good deterrent from straggling. So straggling may have been slightly curtailed by the end of 1862, although we also have to bear in mind that by the end of 1862, the medical departments were getting more efficient at their jobs. So you're seeing a kind of shift in medical culture by the end of 1862, thanks to this kind of command perspective on straggling.
Right. So what's the big takeaway here of Nature's Civil War? If there's something, you can really try and stress to the reader who's seen this interview, is about to pick up this book, what do you hope, after they've read it, might be the big picture idea that they're getting away from life in 1862 Virginia?
I'd say two things. The first one is that medical history of the Civil War has been so wound-focused in the past, also top-down focused, but so wound-focused. And that's actually a contemporary bias we're preserving, that the armies were much more focused on dealing with the problem of wounds and evacuation as well. And disease was the main killer. 2/3 of Civil War mortalities in the ranks were from disease, and it just wasn't addressed as well. So when we think about mortality in the Civil War, the first thing we need to actually imagine is disease. So that would be my number one. And then secondly, mental health. I think today we are, in our current world, in our current military situation, we're extremely focused on traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress, which makes sense because we're just starting to understand those things. But then the impulse, I think, is to take those modern criteria and apply them on the past, on Civil War soldiers. And I think the problem there is we're not actually listening to what contemporaries were saying about their mental health, and the things that often traumatized soldiers of the past are not the things that we are traumatized by today in the military. So for Civil War soldiers, when you look at what they actually say most impacts their morale on a daily basis, a lot of times it was just the environmental, phenomena that they were dealing with, and the homesickness and loneliness that this produced. So you will constantly read about soldiers saying, "I've been sitting in the rain for 5 days. I'm so lonesome I could give up on the war." So, I mean, we may look at that and say, well, a rainstorm is traumatizing them? Well, no. I mean, it's the cultural situation of having never been away from home and then being forced to face 24/7 in this terrible exposure so far away from your loved ones. And that is something they were traumatized by. So we need to take it seriously. Soldiers came up with coping mechanisms for that kind of trauma, and we need to understand it on their terms.
Absolutely. And Dr. Meier, I'll let you go on this one. This project, I realize, is barely in the rear view, but what do you have lined up next? What's the next project?
Yeah. Next, there's always an next, right?
Yes.
I'm working right now on a biography of Confederate General Jubal Early, and I'll be investigating how Jubal Early's particular war experience and traumas really affected his post-war explication of lost cause mythology. And I think very much today we're still living under this man's shadow based on his particular war experience. So it's important that we understand the kind of hold that he has had over us in our modern conceptions of the Civil War.
Well, sounds like a very intriguing second project. So thank you so much for taking a bit of your time today, Dr. Meier, to speak with us. Again, the book is Nature's Civil War, Common Soldiers and the Environment in 1862 Virginia, out with UNC Press. A really fascinating look on the ground. Again, as you've mentioned, there are so many works out there that have kind of done that top-down, wound-centric approach. And I think it's important to realize just what else was out there. And was ever present for these men on the campaign in '62 when they weren't getting shot at. Life was just as dangerous, if not actually more so. So, Dr. Meier, thanks so much for joining us, and hopefully we can have you on again to talk about a future project.
Thanks so much.